Being surrounded by those smells no longer brought peace and comfort and beauty. Instead, it brought with it pain. I get very, very sick when I'm pregnant where I cannot even hold down water. And I began bleeding heavily one day. And I just told my husband, I said, I know that I'm miscarrying. And actually had someone make the comment to me, well, at least you didn't lose a real baby. I think my ideas around miscarriage were false. I thought that it was something that is over very quickly. It's not. It's something that your body actually takes a very long time to heal from a miscarriage.
Hey, welcome back to Good Grief. Today on this episode, I'm going to be chatting with Emily Curtis, who is the author of Hope In The Mourning, a beautiful collection of stories full of people who have walked and are walking out their grief and loss, and how they've found certain things helpful and unhelpful on the journey, and also their story of turning toward Christ in the midst of their loss. Emily is a wife, a mother of 4 kids, and hanging out in North Carolina. Emily, great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Did I get that right? You got 4 kids, hey?
Yes.
And your amazing husband is taking care of them right now and doing the bedtime routine. What's life look like for your family?
It's busy. It's busy in the best way, though. I've got an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and I homeschool all of them. So we're getting ready to start the homeschool season in August. We're a very musical family. I have a music degree, and my son plays piano and organ. My daughter plays violin. My other son plays cello, and my youngest, my 4-year-old, just started piano as well.
That's the best. I love that. I didn't know that about you guys.
Yeah.
That's a fun, full household.
Yes.
How often do you guys get on the instruments?
It's nonstop. Like there's literally never a quiet moment at home. So everyone's either playing an instrument or singing, and we love it.
So I wanted to learn drums, but my parents wouldn't let me. Have any of your kids wanted to learn drums yet?
So my husband was a drummer. My husband is a guitarist and a drummer. And honestly, I don't know if my nerves can take the drums all day long, just because my kids, they love music so much that they play all the time. And so drums might be a little bit much. Thankfully, my daughter, who's the violinist, she has really good intonation. And so it's not painful to hear her practice, thankfully. Right. So they all do a great job.
I love that. Well, hot tip from my parents was they said you can play drums when you can afford a drum kit. So it took me about until I was 16 or 18 somewhere until I finally could get
smart.
one. And when, we talk about your 4 kids, that's your kids that are earth side here. We're going to talk also about your kids that are heaven side as well, which is a huge part of your journey. But
yes.
What's life like out in North Carolina at this time of year as well?
It's warm out here, and my husband even warned me. He said there might be thunder during this podcast because, we're right in the middle of the summer storms, which I love. That's my favorite kind of weather. Just to me, it just feels peaceful, and you can just stay home and curl up with a good book, and I love that. I love being outside too, but there's something magical about the rain.
So is it sort of similar? Do you guys get storms at night and then it'll clear out through the day?
For the most part, we do get a little bit of rain now and then and some storms sometimes during the day, but it's definitely not unusual to get nighttime summer storms for sure.
And I was saying to you, I love North Carolina, or North and South. I've traveled the States a lot, but forgive me for not knowing exactly, but the Carolinas for Shake Shack, it's one of my favorite places to stop and get one of the, how many shakes are on there? Like there's 100 shakes? Or?
I don't even know. It is probably hundreds of combinations that you can make. I know that they have it up in the mountains, which is one of our favorite places to go.
Oh, amazing. Oh, so cool. Hey, let's get into this. Hey, I want to talk about your book and some of the incredible stories in here. But first, I think it'd be really important to know where this was born from. And you talk about it in your preface, but you saw something online that really started this whole thing back in 2016. Can you tell us a bit about that story?
Yeah, so I actually went to a college in Southern California, which is where I'm originally from. And I was friends there in the music department with a young lady named Brighton. And I moved to North Carolina when I got married, and she stayed there, and she ended up getting married out there. And 6 weeks after she got married, her husband was hit by a drunk driver and killed. And we hadn't really stayed in contact other than occasionally through social media. And at that time, Facebook was the thing. And so that's how we were staying in contact from time to time. But I just felt like, what do you say? What do you do with somebody that has just had such a grievous loss, like such an unexpected loss? And she was very young when that happened as well. And that actually led me to start a company called Gifts of Hope. And I created gifts for grieving people at that time. And that's where a lot of my poetry.
Right. Is that what you sort of, it's like a trial, right? Did you trial it with her in terms of how you reached out?
Yeah, kind of. So I just really felt burdened to reach out and love her in some way that I could. And so for me, that was going to be tangible. And so I sent her a gift that was filled with tangible? Cards.
Why tangible?
Well, for one thing, I feel like something that they can see and touch and hold. And in this instance, I made it for her first Christmas, and we put in there like a really warm blanket that she could just kind of wrap herself in, tea that she could have, a bunch of cards from ladies in our church, including other widows. Wow. And then I made her a special locket that had different charms in it that represented her husband's life, just things that she could actually see and hold and just wrap herself in comfort during that season.
It's beautiful. And how much of that, because I mean, you mentioned your grandmother, how much of her played a part in starting, this whole movement?
Yeah. So my grandma and we go to the beach every year, and she was with us for that. And we just started talking about the fact that there's a need that they send flowers and the flowers die, and they have to watch that. And we wanted something that could be more lasting. And so at that time we were saying, my slogan was actually a lasting alternative to flowers. And that's where the poetry was born too, because a lot of times you don't know what to write in the card. And so the poetry was so that you could pick a poem and sign your name to it. And it was something that was going to really meet them where they were at, but you didn't have to be the one to think through the words. And so out of that,
it's too hard to think through what words to write. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And nobody wants to say the wrong thing. We're all fearful of that. And so out of that, I just kept meeting people that had gone through trial after trial after trial. And a lot of people, I think because of kind of that safety of social media where you have that screen in front of you, they were very vulnerable with me. And they shared with me several things that had been said to them that were hurtful. And a lot of them were said to them within the church and unintentionally. But that's where this idea was born. It was like, these people have to hear their stories. They have to see the hope that they have, how they've gotten through tremendous difficulties, really with just being anchored in the Lord. But also people need to know what to say and what they should not say.
Yeah, totally. Tools and resources like that are so important. That's one of the, there are many elements to this book. One of the incredible practical elements is at the end of every chapter, I love it, is seeing what things were helpful, what things were unhelpful, what scriptures were helpful, what resources or songs, hymns, I think that's so powerful. You also mentioned there about flowers, and we've just gone through having a baby and then a hospital run and then birthdays and you get flowers. But in our house when my dad died was full of flowers. It was like a florist. But you got to tend to them and you've got to water them. You've got to remove and they die. And so after a death, you're then now tending for something else that's dying. And then the smell and it's too much. It's
my husband had a cousin whose 13-year-old died of cancer, and they're not in this book. But his mom had mentioned exactly what you just said, where those smells, what once were wonderful smells, especially to a woman, the fragrance of flowers was replaced with something that had a very strong negative connotation. And so being surrounded by those smells no longer brought peace and comfort and beauty. Instead, it brought with it pain. And so we wanted something that could replace that and be something that they look at every time that they drink that tea or wrap themselves in that blanket, that they're reminded that somebody cared about them and loved them. And I do not have that business anymore. I exchanged that for this project because as a homeschool mom of 4, I need to really focus what my priorities are going to be. And so that was a long prayed over decision because I loved that business, but I felt such a strong calling to this ministry and this project. And so this is kind of my fifth child right now.
Wow. So, okay, let's go there for a moment. You mentioned your fifth child. You guys have really walked a long journey of miscarriage. Could you unpack that? And I mean, our conversation over the last couple of weeks and back and forth has really unlocked a few things that I want to talk about here. But could you just tell us a bit more about your family?
Yeah. So I had 3 children, all about 2 years apart. And then we got pregnant again. I think that was in 2018. And we were pregnant, and I get very, very sick when I'm pregnant. I actually get a condition called hyperemesis gravidarum where I cannot even hold down water. And
I've never even heard of that. I mean,
yeah,
I feel like now I'm hearing more things about pregnancy, like that we've had a baby that I've never even heard of. Can you say that one more time? It's called
hyperemesis gravidarum, which means that you get unusually sick. And so usually in my pregnancies, within the first 6 weeks, I lose about 10 pounds. And it's very, very rough on your body. And honestly, I have had moments where, I would be a volunteer for the ultrasounds at the crisis pregnancy centers. And I remember telling them with one of my children that it was important for them to understand that if women had this condition, they may opt to abort a wanted baby because that's how sick you are. Like you feel like you are imprisoned with this sickness. Anyway, I reached about 7.5 weeks in that pregnancy and was still not feeling sick, which was very unusual to me and starting to make me feel concerned. So I remember asking friends, who had multiple kids, did you ever have a pregnancy that was unusual and different from the others? And, they all kind of want to be, kind of make you feel better. But in the end, as a mom, and, I think I got to be about 8.5, almost 9 weeks. And we had not had an ultrasound yet. We hadn't had the first one yet. And, I began bleeding heavily one day. And I just told my husband, I said, I know that I'm miscarrying. And I remember calling the doctor's office and I couldn't talk to them. Like my voice just would not, I was just crying so much that he had to take the phone. And with that one, I actually went to the doctors because I was having severe pain in my abdomen as well. So they rushed me to the doctor that next day and they did the ultrasound and they could see where the sac was, but the baby wasn't there. And so they were really concerned that it was ectopic at that point. So they rushed me over to the hospital and we had to walk back and forth trying to find the right room that we had to go to with the nurse. They couldn't find it. And then I get seated in there and they're trying to find an IV. They can't get it in. And it all felt like a cruel joke, to just, that you're losing this baby and yet you're going through all this different pain. And honestly, during that, I had what was called a blighted ovum, which means that it's a miscarriage where the sac forms, but the baby dies very soon after fertilization. And so you don't see it there on the ultrasound.
Sure.
And, my sweet husband, he didn't quite understand. The doctor actually had to come in and say, no, it was a baby. It just didn't fully form. And I actually had someone make the comment to me, well, at least you didn't lose a real baby. And that is gut wrenching,
Wow.
Because it's a real baby to you, and as a mom, the second you see those 2 pink lines, you're a mom. Totally. And you envision what your future will look like with that child. And so my husband and I felt very strongly that we wanted to name that child. And so we did. We named that child Hallel. And that means praise. And that is how we felt. We felt like, what? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And in God's grace, almost exactly a year from the time I miscarried, we gave birth to our 4th child, a little girl named Alea, and that her name means joyful. And she's just a little ray of sunshine to us. And so, we actually had decided we were done having kids and we weren't going to have any more. Right. And the Lord changed my husband's heart on that. And so I actually had another miscarriage this past November. And it was again another early miscarriage. And it was one that I hadn't told anybody except my parents that we were pregnant. And And then I just had another miscarriage in June. And, I refer to them as secret sorrows because it's become so, unfortunately, faux pas to mention a pregnancy prior to 12 weeks. And especially as believers, or even just as pro-lifers, we believe that life begins at conception. And so a life is a life. We have named every single one of those children, and they're precious to us.
And this is something that this was one of the unlocks about you mentioning, just how you've named each of your children that have gone to be with the Lord. And I was just like, man, that is so sweet, because it's this learning journey. We shared miscarriage stories, and we still haven't named our little one from a year ago. And we're still working that out in our own grief, especially now with our daughter who's 3 months old. There's so much joy wrapped up in her that we haven't had time and space to continue processing, our one that we lost. Can you tell us a little bit about how you maybe two-part question. You and your husband, you've now walked the journey 3 times. They're different each time. They're different children. How do you reconcile those losses yourselves, and then how do you reconcile them with God?
Yeah. So honestly, the first one in some parts was hard, uniquely because I had never had a miscarriage before. And honestly, I did not understand the depth of that pain until going through it myself. And even as a woman, what I think my ideas around miscarriage were false. I thought that it was something that is over very quickly. It's not. It's something that your body actually takes a very long time to heal from a miscarriage. And it's a constant reminder that you lost that baby during that whole season of healing from that miscarriage. And again, as I said to you earlier, it's a secret sorrow largely. And a lot of people, really, even believers, really dismiss it because they just think it was so early on. How could you have had any sort of attachment to that child? And with our first one, my now oldest daughter, she was 4, and she was devastated. I mean, she really loved that baby and was so excited about that baby. And I remember the day that we told our kids that we had lost the baby, we sat around our table and we sang "How Great Thou Art." And for a long time, my little girl actually didn't like that song afterwards because she was like, "Mommy, that song makes me sad now."
It's attached.
And and so even as a parent, learning to how do you love your children through grief? How do you come alongside them gently and age appropriately? So the Lord used that a lot to teach me how to come alongside them. And but I would say they were each different. With the one that I just experienced in November, again, was very early, but very, very sad. We were excited about that. And honestly, I'm not super young anymore. And so I really wasn't fully convinced we would have any more kids. And then the one that we just lost, something that would have been special about that baby is that its due date would have been on my grandfather's birthday.
Wow.
And my grandfather is 94 years old and loves the Lord with all his heart. And it would have just been such a special thing. But the Lord knows, and we really do trust that the Lord knows and that he sees, and that even when things don't feel good, he does have our good in mind.
You mentioned and amen to that. You mentioned the faux pas, the taboo-ness around miscarriage and this idea of waiting for 12 weeks. And I think we've had this chat now with friends that are on, falling pregnant about when do they reveal these things. And it's like this, on one hand, if you share it with more people, they can pray for you, they can walk the journey with you. If something is to happen like miscarriage, they can then be there for you through that. Yeah. But if you don't tell people, then you might not have anyone there to support you if that outcome plays out. It's this catch-22 on both sides. So I can understand the 12-week thing, but I think it's knowing who your inner circle, your trusted few are that walk with
Yes.
you, that encourage you, that uplift you in scripture and in prayer.
Yeah.
Let them in on the journey.
Yeah. And, sometimes there are going to be people, kind of what you're saying, they're going to be people that you're interacting with because you're close to them. And, the baby that I lost, I actually lost it on Thanksgiving Day. And so here it was my son's birthday. So Thanksgiving was his birthday. And it was Thanksgiving. So we had to go be with family. And I remember telling my husband, like, I don't know if I can go and put on a false happy face. And so we called just a handful of people that were close to us in the family that were going to be there and told them what had happened and said, I may need to dismiss myself to go upstairs for a little bit if I need to. And,
that's so
but I
real.
think that it's important. Yeah. It's important to let people that are in your inner circle know so that you can actually grieve that child.
Totally.
And I think that grief, as I'm sure you've experienced in your losses, grief is just an expression of love. And as a mom or as a dad, you love all your children, regardless of how long you've gotten to know them or, knowing that they're going to join your family. Like there's that anticipation and that excitement. And, this last baby that we were pregnant with, my husband, he told me, he's like, I'm so excited. I feel almost more excited for this one. And part of that was because we were not anticipating to have another child join our family. But through that, God had changed our hearts so much to just see what an inexpressible treasure every child is. Totally. And our kids are getting a little older now. And, our youngest is 4 and we're soaking every minute of it up. And we were excited to have another one as well.
How do you like to think about your kids in heaven? What do you guys talk about that? Do you imagine? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that my husband and I really talk about that a whole lot. We did, as I mentioned, we did name them all. We named them all from the Psalms. And so we have Hallel and Selah. And then our last one is Zion. And that means 7 in Hebrew. And it's from Psalm 119. And that was our 7th baby. And so that's why we chose that name. But I do, I think about the fact that my grandparents are getting older and, it'll be a matter of so many years before they're with the Lord. And so they're going to get to meet those children before I do. And, there is a comfort in knowing that, like I have told my husband before, that it's almost like the sweetest grace. It's a bittersweet grace because I know that those 3 children, they never experienced sin. They never experienced heartache. They never have to walk through the pains of this world. They went straight into the arms of Jesus. And so they got to, they were people. They were human beings, but the Lord graciously has secured those kids in heaven. And I pray that all of my children that are here on earth come to know and love the Lord in a very rich and real way. But I know that I have 3 children secured for me in heaven, which is such a comfort to my heart.
Whoa, that is an incredible thought. Wow. Wow. I mean, sitting here, I'm just reflecting as you're sharing that because, we've got one here and one there, and now I can totally see that. And so it sounds like both your parents, they're still with us in their 90s,
yes.
And Brent's parents as well?
Yeah, so those are actually my grandparents who are in their 90s.
Oh,
and then both of my parents are in their 60s. And Brent has both of his parents. And he has both of his grandmothers. Well, no, sorry. He has his grandmother. His other grandmother passed away our first Christmas that we were married.
Sure.
So he has both of his parents and one of his grandmothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess why I'm sharing this is because I kind of think maybe we've dwelt on it more because Kaylee and I have lost a parent each. And we think about the comfort it brings for our kids to be with them in heaven, waiting until we arrive. And so that's probably where that conversation sort of opened. Yeah. Wow. All right. Where should we take this from here? Thank you so much for sharing about your journey of miscarriage. I think we need to speak more about it, more openly, more often, more publicly. And I didn't know until we walked through it. Likewise with you guys. And so I think people listening on the other end, that have walked miscarriage or are currently in that season of life, just I can sense that they're taking a deep breath and going, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was the day after I began my miscarriage that I wrote a poem on it and put it on Instagram, because
Yes.
it made me realize that like, it's okay for me to grieve that child. It's okay for me to cry, even though, we had only known with that child, we'd only known for maybe a week that we were pregnant with this last one. And so again, it's like, sometimes you almost feel like, okay, I probably shouldn't cry over this. I really didn't know that I was pregnant very long. And it was just, the Lord just kind of put it on my heart one night that that's okay. That's okay to be sad about that. That's okay to grieve that and to cry. And, and again, as I said, a lot of times it is a secret sorrow, but especially with this project that I have, I want to be as vulnerable with my sorrows and my heartaches as I ask these writers to be. And, my miscarriages were painful, but I don't feel as if my pain holds the weight that theirs does, and,
Sure.
So in that sense, that's why I didn't choose to write myself other than the poetry in this book, because I felt like the weight of their tragedies far surpassed what I was going through. And that was my own perspective on my own grief. But the authors that have written in here have been so candid in their grief, and they didn't hold anything back. And that was for the benefit of the reader.
Yeah. These are some of the most raw pieces of writing and literature I've come across. And like I said to you, when you sent us this beautiful book and you'd sort of highlighted in your press release, we'll talk about it shortly, one of the stories. It was a Friday afternoon and I was sort of wrapping up for the week, and I thought it was sitting on my desk, and I thought I'll just read just that story you've got there. And I told you there was about 3, maybe 4 times, and it's only 3 pages of a story. It's not chapters, it's 3 pages in a book. And about 3 or 4 times I had to get up from my desk, walk around the house. I was on the ground weeping, just sobbing for the story that I was reading. And so I think this book, I was thinking about it, I think this is the kind of book that you have close by, but you pick up when you need a sense of to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel not so alone or isolated, and to be encouraged and turn toward Jesus when you need it most. I think that is what this book for me is like. It's not a cover to cover read.
Yeah.
It's a pick up and read when you need one of those elements. And so it's incredible. Can we just circle back before we might come back to it again, but Miscarriage, you mentioned your poem. Would you be up for reading that beautiful poem?
Sure, I have it right here. It says, "It's okay to grieve and it's okay to cry. It's okay to sing yourself a languished lullaby. The source of secret sorrow that no one really sees makes you more like Jesus when it drives you to your knees. So it's okay to grieve and it's okay to cry. Tears water flowers of faith that grow in darkest night. Jesus sees the tears you cry and the thoughts inside your head. He's with you in the stillness when you're overwhelmed with dread. It's okay to grieve and it's okay to cry. When you're walking paths of pain, let Jesus walk beside. Let him take your grief and all the tears you cry. Let him give you songs of joy in place of lullabies. He is strong and able even when you're weak. He hears the utterances of your heart when you simply cannot speak. So it's okay to grieve and it's okay to cry, but rest your aching soul on the one who brings new life. Let him shelter you and bring you through the storm, and at the journey's end, your heart will take new form."
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. What is the process like writing poetry when it comes from so much pain?
I've written a lot of these poems in here through different seasons that I've gone through in life. And some of them were born out of learning of these stories, and some of them were born out of just really a heavy heart. And that, I think that is something that the Lord has gifted me in I truly believe that all of the gifts that the Lord gives us are not for our own glory and not to keep to ourselves. It's for the benefit of others. And so,
Totally.
all of my poetry, I really try to bring things out in the open and really they're heavy in the start because that's how we feel when we're in the midst of grief. Or, I've also battled bouts of postpartum depression, deep postpartum depression. And in those seasons, the Lord kind of brought me healing through writing. And, but he brings it full circle, because we're not left in our grief and we're not left in our suffering because Jesus is a redeemer. He came to redeem our suffering and to save us from those pains. And, it doesn't mean that the life here on earth is going to be less painful or less wrought with grief, but it means that we have a hope that this life is not all that we have. And not only can we place our hope in the life to come, but Jesus says there can be joy, even amidst the suffering. And that's something that I've learned a lot along the way, that grief and joy can and do coexist. And that's okay. That people don't need to feel guilty because the Lord is giving them joy in a season or on a particular day. Because you've lost a loved one doesn't mean that you're not allowed to also smile and feel joy. That's okay too. That's good and right. And the Lord created all of our emotions, and they can all honor the Lord and benefit others in their right season.
And I feel we do feel that guilt and shame when joy rises up, especially early in grief, because we think, no, we should just be feeling one way right now because the person we loved is gone. But you're so right. The joy and grief 100% can coexist if we're open to it. I love the idea of what glimmers are, that in a day there might be just something small. It might be a ray of sunshine that just hits your face and warms you. It might be a cup of tea that somebody makes for you, just something small to realize there are things to be grateful for. And as we start to we place them one on top of the other, we can start to build a day where eventually in the start we have more bad days than good days, but eventually that flips and we start to go, wow, if we look back, I can now start to see that I have more good days in a week than bad days. And from there, seeing you, and especially only recently after a miscarriage, sit here and still share the hope of glory, still share of the joys that you experience in your life because you've walked that out and you've meditated on it. You've considered where areas of your life are full of grief and sorrow, but also where there are plenty of moments of joy. So it's a big balance. And
I think when we know the character of God, that really helps ground us, because we realize that our circumstances are always changing, and they always will be throughout the whole course of our life. And we don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't know what trials are going to come our way. But God does, and God's character is not changing. And so when we see through the scriptures where he cared for the Israelites, where he watched over Moses in that basket all the way, he is a God who redeems, and he is faithful, and he's unable to change. And so we can rest in that, even when we feel like our circumstances are tossing us to and fro in the storm. That's why we have this hope as an anchor. We have Jesus as the anchor, so that in the storm, although we can be tossed to and fro a bit, we're not going to be devastated. We're not going to be shipwrecked, because he's our anchor, and he is faithful and true and good.
And the God of all comfort. You mention it in here. We talk about Lazarus, Jesus' good friend, who dies. Yeah. And Jesus weeps. He weeps even though he knows what is about to take place. And I think, in all of our grief, present day, he weeps with us. He knows the pain. And especially God the Father knows the pain of losing a son, and a perfect son at that as well. In these stories, how did you come up with the concept? I mean, with each story at the end is some of those practical guides. So things that they found helpful, things that were unhelpful. So things to say, things not to say, scriptures that were really timely for them, and also songs. How did you compile those together?
So I wanted the stories to be very vulnerable. That was important to me as the first aspect of things. Partly because I wanted people to not feel alone. As you said, I wanted them to see that other people have felt the depth of your grief before. And although every grief is different, the depth of grief can be similar. And also for those that don't know the Lord, to see that their grief is deep and it's real and it's authentic, and so is their hope. And so that was important to me. And then the Q&A was really intended for the reader. That's because, as I told you earlier, when people would come to me and say, this was said to me, and this was said to me within the church time and time again. And I thought, oh my goodness, people need to know what to say, and people need to know what they shouldn't say and what they shouldn't do. And myself included, I've learned from this. And it's an ongoing learning. There are still better ways that we can present and say things. Yes, absolutely. And this is by no means a conclusive resource, but I think that it's very helpful because you get to actually read their stories. You walk a mile in their shoes for the duration of their chapter, and then you hear from them themselves. These are the things that were helpful. And honestly, nobody comes up to someone and says, what should I not say to you right now? You would never say that. You're just going to sit there and think in your head, oh man, I hope I don't say the wrong thing. That's what we all think. And sometimes it results in us saying, I'm just not going to say anything because I don't know what to say. And I don't want to say the wrong thing. I think that's most of the time. I don't want to say anything in case I say the wrong thing. Yeah. And honestly, that's one of the wrong things that you can do, is because you're basically protecting your own comfort instead of putting yourself out there and saying, you could go up to someone and say, I don't know what to say, but I just want to tell you, I am so sorry. And give them a big hug and cry with them. It's okay to cry with them. That shows that you love them. Yeah. And so the Q&A was really to equip the reader so that they would feel like, okay, I can go in there and I can go and talk to my friend who just became a widow, because I've got 4 stories in here that I can go and read, and I can say to her, okay, I want to come and I want to help you figure out where do the finances go from here? Who's going to help you with your car maintenance? How do we handle switching things over? Do you need help with funeral arrangements? Whatever it might be, there's so many practical resources in here to walk you through that. Have you got some favorite practical things? Like when you think about it, have you got some favorite practical things to say, practical things to do? So there are definitely things that I have learned in here that I would have never even thought. And one of them comes from Annabelle's story that you mentioned. It's called 40 Minutes. And that story, her mom... do you want to give context to that story? Sure. So Annabelle was a little baby that lived for 40 minutes, and she was diagnosed in the womb with kidneys that weren't functioning. And so they knew that as long as she was in the womb, they didn't need to function. And so she was safe as long as she was in the womb. But as soon as she was delivered, they didn't even know if she would make it through the delivery. And by God's grace, she did, but she only lived for 40 minutes. And so they share their story in here. And one of the things that the writer, the mom, her name is Kristen, that she mentioned that I thought I would have never even crossed my mind was, as I mentioned before, calling and asking, can I help you pick out funeral clothes for her? Can I call and make the funeral arrangements? Can I be the go-to person for all the people that are going to come and ask questions, or the people that want to bring you meals? Can I give them my phone number so that you can kind of put that hedge of protection around them during that season? And I believe they went wedding dress shopping as well. Yeah. Yeah. She really tried to experience everything that she would be looking forward to as a mom of a little girl. And so she went and did all these adventures while she was pregnant, including wedding dress shopping, because she knew that would be the only time that she would get to do that with Annabelle. And it really, it is such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful story. And, one of the things that she writes in there that gets me every time is she says that when it was time for her to deliver and the doctor said it's time, and she panicked and thought, how can you, as a mother, do the very thing that will take your baby's life? And she said, it's like pushing your child into oncoming traffic. It goes against every instinct that you have. And yet it was time. It was time to deliver her. And she knew that that would be the very thing that took Annabelle's life. And she writes so beautifully. And honestly, so many of the authors, when I asked them if they would write, probably there's 21 stories, probably 18 of them came to me and said, I'm not a writer, and so I don't really know what to say. And I just told them, I can help you. I can help you with any editing if you need that. But really, I'm not looking for polished stories. And I'm looking for raw and real and vulnerable. And they all did such a great job because it's personal to them. And when it's
There's
personal,
so much to relate to, even though you haven't been through it. That's what's so powerful about it.
Yeah. I mean, they wrote really from their hearts. And I also had so many authors come back and tell me, which was such a blessing to my heart, that it was healing for them to write their stories out. And, it's a big ask to ask people to write out their stories. And are you willing to relive some of your darkest, hardest times for the benefit of other people? And that's what they all agreed to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible blessing that they would give like that so publicly as well. They don't hold anything back. Have you since spoken or heard in terms of, because I know writing is a huge release. You know this, writing poetry and writing over the years. Have you heard from them in terms of, have they felt any form of, reflection or in that grief of writing?
Yeah, I had a lot of people come back to me and say this was really helpful for me. I was really kind of scared to write out my story, and it was helpful. And as I've kind of thought that through in my own mind, something that I wonder is if maybe part of the healing in that is that they bring it full circle too. Like they're weaving in the goodnesses of God that they've seen throughout their story and since their story occurred in that moment. And I think that it helps their hearts dwell on everything good that the Lord has done through that as well. And then, in addition to that, this book, like we do this 100% not for profit. And so that was something that the writers and I all agreed that this is just something that needs to be in people's hands, because we really felt strongly that this was a tool that would help grow the church, especially to really know how to be intentional with people. And we live in a world that's like, it's digital, you're not reaching out and touching people. It's one dimensional, and you can't deal with grief in one dimension.
No, not at all. I love physical books. Like, I don't know when Kindles came out, but it just didn't jazz me. I'm like, I need a book that I can scribble, highlight, write in. And you were telling me that a pastor recently, I mean, these have been going out to not only pastors, but all over. But you said a pastor recently bought like cases of books.
Yeah, actually, we've had several pastors around the country buy cases of books. And
that's amazing.
I had one pastor that ordered books like maybe 2 weeks ago. And he even told me, he was like, we just talked about this at a conference and people were so excited about it that, are you willing, like, can you send it to me? Can we send you a picture of the check and you can send them out? And so we did that. And he wrote me a couple days ago and he said, you won't believe it. They all sold out the very first day we put them out. We'd like to order another case of them. And
come on, that's incredible.
That is completely, it's the Lord. And I view this like, this is not about what a great creation I've made or what great writers everyone is. This is the Lord's story of showing who he is, and the fact that suffering is a part of this fallen world that we live in, but Christ came to redeem it. He came to redeem us. And that is what this was about, was that we wanted, all of the writers and I had a common mindset of saying that this could help comfort those that are grieving and remind them who God is, remind them that they're not alone. That's also where the poetry and the scripture and the hymns came in, were to be comforts to them. But also, we just felt so strongly that the church really needed to step up a little bit in this area and know
armed with resources,
how do we intentionally love other people?
And someone may never read Job or connect with the book of Job, but they might read Hope in the Mourning and connect with Annabelle's story, or the next person. And I think that's so timely and And I was also going to mention, we were talking about pastors there. Pastors don't get it right too. And this is maybe one of the subjects in the church that needs more light. I mean, and it definitely needs more light shed upon it. Pastors don't get things right all the time either. And so I think this is a great resource for them. Have you had any sort of feedback around that regard?
Yeah. So John MacArthur in Los Angeles, California, he has a seminary called the Master's Seminary. And toward the end of their semester last year, they actually gave a book out to every seminary student so that they would be more equipped as well. And that was one of my big dreams with this project, was that it would get into the hands of pastors and that it would help make shepherds out of them, so that, like my husband was a seminary student and he actually went to that seminary as well.
Oh, wow.
And you're trained in scripture, which is wonderful. And that's ultimately what we need to all be rooted in. But you don't have, especially when you're a young pastor, you don't have the experience of walking with people that have gone through these situations. And so not everybody is naturally empathetic. And the reality is, men especially are not naturally empathetic most of the time. Yeah. And I've had so many men come to me with this book, and that has just been a huge joy to me. So many men, including actually the designer of the book. Wow. He's a wonderful, godly man. And he told me, he was like, this has equipped me. Like he's like, I had someone at my church that was going through something. And I was like, I'm going for you. I know what to do now. Like I know how to step into your grief and not be fearful of that, but understand how you can approach somebody, especially as a pastor or a counselor. Approaching somebody from an empathetic standpoint makes all the difference, and totally. It's the difference between having compassion on somebody and not. And we don't want to share scripture with somebody in a cold way. We want to bring the warmth of Christ to them. And that, you see where counselors, when they can empathize with what someone's gone through because they've gone through it themselves, it's a different type of counseling. And totally. This allows them to kind of have a pseudo experience in that grief, and therefore kind of put that in their heart a little bit and think, wow, if I felt that heavy, if it brought me to my knees in tears reading that story, how much more so did they experience going through it? And it gives them a heart of tenderness and compassion and humility.
That is so true. And there are a few things you mentioned there about counseling. That's how we went about picking our counselor. I'm like, I need someone that has walked in our shoes. Otherwise, to me, there's going to be a huge disconnect. And thankfully, we found a Christian counselor who'd lost a child. And I was like, that's good enough. That makes, I'm on, like we're good. And then secondly, you said how, we're talking about men being empathetic. 100%. And in the last week, I've had a number of conversations, one with the founder of a organization in Australia here called, they've got a camp called Camp Magic, and a company called, or an organization called Field of Magic. They help kids through grief. And I was just saying, what is what does the data say about mums and dads, about who brings their kids? And she said, honestly, it's majority mums. They're the ones that reach out and that want support to help take their kids through this. And so I think, yes, as men, we definitely need to be getting this into their hands and having the conversation a whole lot more. And then you mentioned about your editor finding this as a useful tool. Funny you say that. Our editor, his name's Ryan, but we call him El Nacho. He's in the Philippines. He edits this podcast and he'll be listening to this. He's actually told me multiple times how helpful it's been hearing these conversations and walking through these journeys himself, but not having the language or the people or the resources. So it's a really, really powerful thing.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that we forget is that when a child has died, people tend to flock to the mother. There tends to be a decent amount of support for the mother and not as much for the father. But the father also lost a child. But not only that, he has to lead a family through this crisis. And he still has to get up and go to work. Whether it's a week or two later, he still has to get up and go to work. And some women do as well, but not all of them. But men need to come around other men, and they need to let them know as well that, as that poem said, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to cry. It's not, I have an 11-year-old son, and we tell him often, it's okay to cry. As long as you're not crying because you're not getting your way, it's okay to cry. And when you're crying, especially when you're crying for somebody else, that's masculine. That shows compassion and vulnerability. And that's what real men can do. Real men are comfortable to say, you know what? I'm okay getting uncomfortable. I'm okay crying and hugging my friend because, wow, I can't believe that your wife just had a miscarriage. I can't believe that you just lost your child. I'm so sorry you just lost your job. I'm sorry that your wife passed away. But teaching men to set that example. Men there are leaders in our families. There are leaders in our church. And I think that if men can see the importance of being compassionate and loving well, that sets an example for the wives to follow and for the children to follow. And I think that it's a wonderful gift to the church when men can be vulnerable and dive in as well.
Totally. There's something powerful seeing a full-grown man just crying, for whatever the reason. It's a powerful image, and seeing men get around them to support and uplift.
Even as you had mentioned earlier with one of the stories in here, he's a pastor, and we think oftentimes that, well, pastors always know what to say and they're so acquainted with these situations. He didn't. And he'd been a pastor for many years, and his wife and he had a stillborn baby. And he talks about how he went to the hospital and he didn't know what to say. He said, I ended up going to the bathroom and falling on my knees in the bathroom and crying out to the Lord and saying, Lord, I don't know what to say to my wife. And the Lord just put it on his heart, just be still and be with her. And so he left that bathroom, went over to his wife's side and just held her hand and cried with her. And they are one of the most compassionate couples and pastor and pastor's wife that I have ever known. And they've walked through some of the biggest storms you could imagine. She's lost her mother. She lost her brother when he was young. They had a stillborn baby. Right after that stillborn baby, the pastor, he was diagnosed with leukemia. And then they got pregnant with another baby while he was going through treatment. And he couldn't be near his wife because when you're on radiation, you can't be near pregnant people with radiation. Yeah. And so trial after trial after trial, and yet they have been faithful. But just because he's a pastor doesn't mean that he had it all tightly sewn up.
Totally. I think that's a great example to share. And I haven't read that story yet, so that might be my next story. This has been really, really powerful and quite touching and moving, to be honest. I think we should continue these conversations, and I'd love to know from you if this is your current baby, your current project. What's next? What's out there? Are there more books? Are there more poetry? Is there songs?
Yeah. I still write poetry a lot, and I've probably written maybe 10 more poems since this was written. I've also started writing some custom poems for people that I've come across who have lost children. Just people that have started even following me on Instagram, and I notice that they've lost a child. And sometimes I will reach out to them and say, if you'll tell me a little bit about your child, I would like to write you a poem just as my gift to you about them. And there is another book on the horizon that I would like to start. And basically that would be the topics that are not really discussed much in the church. Things like suicide and abuse and depression and things that happen, things that we still face, and we need to be equipped to know how to handle them. And, I think that those are things that we almost feel like we need to kind of be hands off, like those things shouldn't be at all present in the church, but they do, they happen. And, I know I had shared with you earlier that after my third child, I went through severe postpartum depression. And it led me to such a dark point that I did not even tell my husband about it, because there's such a shame that comes with that in the church, that you feel like, oh my goodness, people are going to think that I don't love the Lord, or maybe I'm not really a Christian, like just these doubts. And I really learned that people are so vulnerable when they're left alone in their thoughts, and things, especially like depression, it makes you reclusive. It makes you not want to be around other people. And it's a dangerous place to be, because
it's totally
I feel like Satan
counterintuitive, isn't it? To everything that we need, it removes you from.
Yeah, but Satan can get a foothold there, and for me, honestly, in my story, it got so dark during that season that I finally knew that I had to tell my husband and my mom, because I was getting suicidal thoughts, and I knew that this is not going to end well if I don't tell somebody what's going on. And, even at that time, my husband didn't really know what to do with that, and he's a trained seminarian, and, there are things that, again, coming alongside people in compassion makes a big difference. And I learned after my fourth child, when I started going through that season again, that getting it out in the light and talking to other women and saying, hey, this is what I'm headed for right now.
What's going on? Yeah.
Yes. And I had so many wonderful women come to me and say, I've been there too. Here's what helped me. Can I come over and just hang out with you? And that makes such a difference. Just being with one another and showing up. It takes
talking up. It takes speaking up to open that conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally.
And so, whether it is going through something really dark like depression, or going through a really deep grief like the loss of a child or the loss of a parent or a cancer diagnosis, we need to show up for one another, and we need to be intentional with being the hands and feet of Christ, like jumping in there and saying, I'm here, and I'm here for the long haul.
And I think that's exactly what your book, this current book, does. It gives people tools, and it shows the work that you're doing to be the hands and feet of Christ. And so I want to say thank you. Like I said, most books, when I chat about them, I've read them cover to cover, but I don't feel that this book is that. And so I'm looking forward to now reading the pastor's story next, and probably going through a whole box of tissues on that journey in those few pages. But thanks for hanging out. I appreciate your journey. I appreciate your story. I appreciate your family and your faith as well. So thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Hey, if this episode has blessed you, I really hope it has, with this conversation with Emily. Jump in the links below. Pick up a copy of Hope in the Mourning. It'll be delivered faster than you can say Amazon, and I can't wait for you to be blessed by this and the stories and the people's journeys inside of it. But until next time, from Kaylee and myself, big love and God bless.